Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Bridie, and well, thanks to everybody from Full Circle who has organised tonight. But most of all, thanks to all of you for deciding to come along and have a listen to what I have to say. And yes, I am indeed here to tell you all about my book, Sound System: The Political Power of Music. It seems to me that anyone who wants to change the world would be well advised to begin by answering two questions. The first question was most famously posed by the great soul singer Marvin Gaye, and the second by the Russian revolutionary Lenin. What's going on and what is to be done? Appropriate to be quoting Lenin today, don't you think, by the way? 100 years since the revolution, for those who didn't know. So let's begin with what's going on. It seems to me that we are living through a period of political polarisation, the like of which I haven't seen before, certainly in my adult lifetime. I think that we are seeing millions of people all around the world start to question, and many of them to reject, the old so-called centre ground in politics. I say so-called because actually what people refer to when they talk about the centre ground was never a sensible middle point. I'm talking more about this consensus that has existed for several decades around neoliberal economics and all of the policies associated with that. It seems to me that millions of people are starting to question and to reject that, and they are casting around for alternative ideas. Now, in Britain, we've seen this sort of surprise, it's taken many people by surprise, this significant amount of support for Jeremy Corbyn, self-described socialist. And actually we saw a similar sort of thing happen last year in the United States, didn't we? We saw thousands of predominantly young people enthused by the campaign of Bernie Sanders, another self-described socialist who ran on a platform of social and economic justice. To some degree, and you might have something to say about this in the discussions, to some degree we see a similar thing, I think, with the relative success of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who did surprisingly well at the French elections. You had Syriza when they were first elected in Greece, Podemos in Spain. All of these examples suggest to me that there is a significant audience, that there are millions of people who are potentially interested in and could be persuaded by left-wing politics, what I personally would call progressive politics. But again, I'm not assuming that everyone at the Full Circle this evening shares my views, but what I would call progressive politics. But you know what? Where the left aren't making gains, or sometimes in parallel with those gains, we have seen the populist right and sometimes the far right making gains. We saw that recently in Germany and in Austria and so on. And I think that this is very worrying indeed. So what is to be done? Well, there are, of course, lots of things that can and must be done to ensure that the progressive side of this period of polarisation wins out, to make sure that we pass a better world on to future generations. What I argue in the book is this. One of the battlegrounds in the fight for a better world, and I believe that we should all, I think it's incumbent on us all, wherever we live and whatever we do for a living, I think it's incumbent on us all to get stuck in to that battle for a better world. What I argue in the book is that one of the battlegrounds is culture. Because it seems to me that the images that surround us every day, on the billboards and on the internet and on television, in films, the stories that we share with one another, and indeed the music that we experience, I think that all of these things have a significant impact on the way that we feel about ourselves, each other, and the world that we share. We can have music that distracts us from the things that matter. We can have music that stirs up sort of tribalistic enmity, music that marches us off to fight unnecessary and unjust wars. Or We can have music that brings people together in a spirit of celebration. We can use music to reach new audiences with progressive ideas. We can give people some hope and some confidence and an expanded sense of what's possible. So after more than 2 decades now of touring, working as a professional musician, but mainly touring as a guitarist with different bands, as Bridie mentioned, after more than 2 decades of doing that, I decided that it was time for me to try to get to grips with this strange political power that I believe music has. And the result is this book. I don't actually mention him in the book, and I don't usually mention him in these talks, but you lot look like a well-read audience this evening, and so therefore I'm going to mention to you that some of the ideas I explore in the book are influenced by the great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. What I take from Gramsci is the idea that all of culture is politically contested. It's not just elections that are politically contested. Everyday culture is too. If you have any success with a piece of music, if it resonates with a mass audience, then different people will try to pull not only the economics of the thing, they'll not only try to make money from it, but they'll also try to pull its social and political meaning in different directions. They'll try to contextualize it in such a way that it is seen to be supporting their particular agenda. Now, obviously, if you own the big record companies, the radio stations, the digital platforms and so on, then you're quite well placed to do that. But actually quite simple tricks can sometimes subvert this process and get a different outcome. And I give examples of this from throughout history and across cultures. So everyday culture is politically contested, and I think that the outcome of this contest matters. And actually I think that people who consider themselves to be progressive, people who do not want to see a world riven with nationalism and racism and all these sorts of things, I think we would do well to take that seriously. We would do well to try and better understand the political power of culture, because actually I think that compared to people with huge amounts of power and privilege, and indeed establishments, states and other forms of establishment throughout history, I think that we are playing catch up, because I think that they have understood the political power of culture for quite some time. You can probably all think of examples of the state banning music events. I'll give you a couple. There's a music which has come out of the city that I live in, London, which has now gone pretty mainstream, in the UK at least. It's called grime. Has grime made it to Brussels yet? You've heard of grime, anyone? I'm talking about the music genre, not the... Well, grime is it's a bit like hip hop. It has rappers, it has electronic beats, more exciting than hip hop in my biased opinion. The beats are faster, and it's a very interesting new form of music. And as I say, it's gone mainstream in the UK. In fact, one of the rising stars of the grime scene, a guy called Stormzy, not only has he had a #1 album, but he's also now a judge on X Factor. It was a hashtag on Twitter, Grime for Corbyn, that helped to revive the fortunes of the Labour Party at the last election. Grime MCs took over the other stage at Glastonbury, which those of you who have been to the Glastonbury Festival, you'll know that the other stage is one of the bigger stages. So grime music has really gone mainstream. But not long before all those things happened, not long at all before those things happened, grime gigs, grime get-togethers, grime parties near where I live in Brixton in South London were routinely shut down by the police. And in fact, exactly the same thing happened in the early days of rave music. We must have some ravers in the house. Anyone old enough to remember the early days of rave? 1, 2, there you go. Then the rest of you won't know that actually The Conservative government at that time, I'm talking about the sort of the early to mid-90s, the Conservative government in Britain at that time, I think it would have been John Major's government by then, I think Thatcher had gone, the government actually passed a piece of legislation that specified that any gathering of over a certain number of people at which music characterised by repetitive beats is played is now outlawed. That phrase, repetitive beats, actually entered into British law in 1994. Now, what the police will tell you is that they were simply responding to complaints about disturbances to the peace. Nothing more to it than that. But I think that something a bit more fundamental was going on. I think these were scenes that worried the authorities. Because in each of these examples, what you had were large numbers of predominantly young, working class people coming together to enjoy music, often in unsanctioned venues. This was not music that had come from the mainstream corporate music industry at the time. It most certainly hadn't been commissioned by the state. I think that the authorities felt that they didn't understand it, they were worried they couldn't control it, and so they decided they had to shut it down. Now, when I did my research for the book, what I discovered is that this sort of suspicious, antagonistic relationship between an establishment and the music preferred by large numbers of ordinary people, that this sort of thing has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And so just to make sure that our discussion has a proper sense of historical perspective, I'd like to take us back, if I may, to 12th century Europe, where the establishment was made up of the popes and the abbots of the Catholic Church and the feudal lords. Now, this was an establishment who were very worried that ordinary people might one day rise up and demand a better lot in life. Conditions for most of us would have been pretty grim back in the days of feudalism. And so what the establishment did was that it peddled quite aggressively the idea that the social order is ordained by God. The implication, of course, being that to challenge it was not only futile, but blasphemous. So don't even think about challenging it. And they used music to reinforce this message. They commissioned composers to compose music which they hoped would encourage congregations to gaze upward in quiet spiritual contemplation. And they banned any music that they thought might get those same people thinking about worldly pleasures. Now, repetitive beats weren't yet a problem in the 1150s, but the authorities decided that certain combinations of notes were certain intervals, as we musicians call them. In fact, the most unstable sounding, the most difficult sounding, the most dissonant interval. Are there any musicians who know the one I'm talking about? Well, give me the musical term for it, if you can remember it. The tritone. Excellent. Top marks. Have another champagne. Treat yourself. It's also called the augmented fourth or the diminished fifth. But in this period, it was indeed labelled by the establishment diabolus in musica, the devil in music. For the non-musicians, I brought my guitar along so you can hear this devilish sound. Prepare to be scared, yeah. By the way, never judge a guitarist by the size of their amplifier. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Here we go. The augmented fourth, diminished fifth, tritone, otherwise known as the devil's interval. Pretty scary stuff, eh? I can see you quaking. Of course, the sound now is familiar to most of us. It's not so scary to us now. It has actually been used quite a lot in music in the intervening years, there's lots of examples of this. One of my favourites is the intro to Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix. Because what Jimi's doing, Jimi is playing a B-flat octave. But the bass player is playing an E. So what you hear when you put them together is the devil's interval. It's also right at the beginning of the theme tune to The Simpsons. Do you have The Simpsons in Brussels? Oh, you're all far too worldly wise and well educated to waste your time with such things. But I digress. Where were we? So 12th century Europe. 12th century Europe, that sound was completely taboo. It was completely out of bounds. But you know what? Even this, even the sweet-sounding bedrock of Western musical harmony, the third, even this was taboo. Even that. Now, what do you think ordinary people did about these restrictions? Hazard a guess. Huh? They went underground. They didn't even go that far underground. They ignored them essentially. So yes, away from the cathedrals and the churches, in the lowly taverns, on the street corners, in the marketplaces, precisely the sound of thirds moving in parallel became popular, this sort of thing. Except it wouldn't have been a guitar. We wouldn't have heard it on a guitar. It would have typically been two voices singing in parallel, or two copper horns called lyres, which were very popular at the time. The lyre is noteworthy because it's the only instrument that I know of that has a butter named after it. Do you have Lurpak butter over here? There you go. You're going to remember this talk when you're at the supermarket next week, and you're going to go to the butter aisle and have a look at the logo of the Lurpak butter. So anyway, this was, if you will, the rave or the grime of its time. Loved by the people, loathed by their rulers. And this musical standoff lasted for nearly 2 centuries, until famine swept across Europe with plague in its wake. Conditions for ordinary people became completely unbearable. And so they did rise up. They started to set fire to the chateau of the noble lords. They started to attack members of the nobility, of the feudal lords. They started to attack members of the nobility in the streets. They started to refuse to pay money to the church and to the feudal lords, which they had until that point been compelled to do. And so the establishment faced a real crisis. They were more keen than ever to peddle the message that the social order is ordained by God, but they recognised that that had become a pill too bitter for most people to swallow. And so, eventually, and somewhat reluctantly, they agreed to sweeten it by accepting popular innovations, including in musical harmony. This was the beginning of the European Renaissance. You could, at last, use the third in official establishment and church compositions. Now that really set the stage for the whole canon of Western classical music that would follow, but we see this sort of thing happening time and time again. We see a situation where we have an establishment that essentially is afraid or nervous about ordinary people and who therefore try to restrict the music of ordinary people. I want to give you one more example, and that is the history of Carnival. Do you have Carnival here in Brussels? A lot? Everywhere. Yeah, there's some big ones here, right? Yeah. Well, as you're probably aware, the biggest in Britain is the Notting Hill Carnival. Particularly poignant this year, actually, for reasons which I'm sure many of you know about. Particularly poignant. Now, the roots of the Notting Hill Carnival is probably the same with Belgium, but certainly the roots of the Notting Hill Carnival are in Trinidad, the Caribbean island of Trinidad. And Trinidad still has one of the world's biggest, and in my opinion, one of the best carnivals. If ever you get the chance to go to Trinidad at carnival time, seize the opportunity, you're going to love it. Carnival time, by the way, for those who are used to the upside down British way of doing things. It's not in August. Carnival time everywhere else in the world is just before Lent, so sort of March, April, that sort of time of the year. Most people quite like Carnival these days. Some people love it. 150 years ago, the British colonial authority in Trinidad hated it. They saw it as a very powerful symbolic challenge to their authority, and they decided they were going to stop it. Captain Baker and his troops went charging in with the truncheons flying, but the festival goers, the carnival goers fought back. The clashes went on for several hours. Eventually the troops and the police were pushed back and Carnival was saved. Today's 1881. It's celebrated to this day in Trinidad. It's described as the legendary Canboulay riot of 1881. By the way, that Canboulay, when I was in Trinidad asking around, people seem to think that it comes from the French can brûler. I wonder if anyone speaks French in the audience this evening. Can brûler, I'm probably pronouncing it badly. Burnt cane, right? Am I pronouncing it okay? Give me the proper pronunciation. Can brûler. Because what would happen is the carnival goers would set fire to the sugarcane, the crop that would symbolise for many of them their oppression, and then they would march into town in celebration. Well, as you can imagine, the authorities were none too pleased. Their attempts to stop Carnival had been thwarted. There was too much popular opposition. They needed a new strategy. They came up with one just 2 years later, 1883. They decided that, okay, they weren't able to take on the whole of Carnival, so what they would do instead is ban the musical heartbeat of Carnival, which back then in the 1880s was like a djembe-style skin drum. They banned drums. Now, the Trinidadian musicians are a resourceful lot. Their attitude was, okay, you've banned drums, we'll simply find an alternative. And they found that alternative growing in abundance all around them on the islands of Trinidad and Tobago, bamboo. They realised that if you took a length of bamboo and banged it on the floor and then hit it with a stick, you got a pretty good approximation of a drum sound. Now, I've got a bit of video of a modern day reenactment of this bamboo group phenomenon, which I'm going to play for you just so that you know I'm not making this stuff up. Have a quick look and listen to this. So bamboo became the new sound of Carnival. As you can imagine, once again, the authorities were none too pleased. Their attempts this time to derail Carnival had been gotten around. And so they passed this piece of legislation trying to inhibit the carnival goers, and this piece of legislation. They'd already banned the wearing of masks. Now they banned certain songs, particularly songs which were rude about the upper classes. They started to ban certain dances, certain profane dances. And then in the 1930s, they banned bamboo. They used the outbreak of the Second World War to temporarily stop Carnival, something that the carnival goers agreed to. So the Trinidadian musicians got together once again, particularly in the poorer parts of east of Port of Spain. They got together and scratched their heads. They thought to themselves, okay, they've banned drums, now they've banned bamboo. What's next? What can we use next? And they noticed that the American Navy who had leased large parts of the island of Trinidad during the Second World War, they noticed that the Navy was starting to litter the island with a huge number of oil drums. One or two of you look like you probably know where the story's going. By the victory in Europe celebrations in Trinidad in 1945, something very similar to the now much loved tuned steel pan was revealed to amazed revellers. The very existence of the instrument underlines our indefatigable desire to express ourselves through music, even when we're facing quite harsh political repression. I look at a number of other case studies in the book. I look at the way that music was used by the dictators of the 20th century. I look at the way that music was used by the CIA during the Cold War. I tell the rather disturbing story of the Romanian-born Greek composer Yannis Xenakis. Then coming into the 21st century, I talk about the significance, as I see it, of the rise in popularity of TV talent shows, things like X Factor, Pop Idol, American Idol, The Voice. I talk about the significance, as I see it, of the rise in popularity of music festivals like Glastonbury, Roskilde, and so on. I talk about Beyoncé and her nod of solidarity last year towards the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly with Formation, the video, and her performance of Formation at the Super Bowl 50. And I also talk about the music of the Arab revolutions of 2010, 2011. And the last of my stories from this introductory talk, I'd like to take from that chapter, if that's okay, because I think it's kind of an important story. The chapter begins as the short-lived Arab Spring did. It begins in Tunisia and it ends in Syria. And in Syria, we find a full-voiced firefighter and part-time poet, a guy called Ibrahim al-Kashush, singing in the town square in Hama, one of the big cities in Syria. And he's singing a song which he's written in what I'm told is a traditional Levantine folk form. It's a call and response form, perfect for asserting political demands. Now, somebody in the square held up their phone and took a bit of footage of this performance. You can't really see Ibrahim al-Kashush, but you can certainly hear him. And I'm going to play you a clip from that. And you'll see that there's a translation that runs along the bottom, a translation in English. But for those of you who, for whatever reasons, can't see the translation or can't read the translation, it's fairly predictable stuff. Every line is laying into the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And the refrain, which people repeat, is "Get out, Bashar." That's the refrain which people repeat. This performance took place on the 27th of June 2011. Have a quick look. I'll skip forward. Let's play it from somewhere there. Ibrahim al-Kashush. As I say, that performance took place on the 27th of June 2011. The regime responded quite quickly. Just a few days later, on the 4th of July, the body of Ibrahim al-Kashouch washed up on the shores of the Orontes River, which runs through Hama. And it was quite clear from the way in which he'd been murdered that he had been murdered precisely because of the performance that we just saw. Now, I felt that it was important to include that story in my book because some people have said to me, Dave, music doesn't really change the world. The best that music and musicians do is provide a soundtrack while other people go out and try to change the world. And very often that's true. Very often that is the most that musicians do. But what the music of the Arab revolutions reminds us of is that sometimes music and musicians are absolutely central to critical moments of mass struggle. They can help to give confidence to long oppressed people. They can help to cohere people around a set of political demands. And some of them have paid the highest possible price for their courage. Let me start to sum up by saying this. The book isn't just a series of case studies. I do try to sort of draw out the threads running through each of them and to arrive at some conclusions. And therefore the penultimate chapter is my Rebel Music Manifesto. A set of ideas, really, a set of suggestions about the sorts of things that we might want to try to think about doing in order to make sure that music enriches the lives of all of us rather than just lines the pockets of the few. I've tried to make the book as accessible and as entertaining as possible. I do actually hope very much that people will give it a try, have a little dip into it, let me know what they think. The ideal for me, the ideal scenario would be if my book is just my small contribution to a much bigger conversation about this stuff. Because I think that the more thoroughly we understand the way that culture influences the way that we feel and think and the values that we have, I think the more that we understand the mechanisms at work, the better place we will be to intervene consciously, to get something better, the better place we will be to start to create the kind of culture that I think we deserve and that we badly need at the moment. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you think about all this stuff. But for now, I want to thank you so much for listening so respectfully to what I had to say. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.